If I've got 20 minutes to do a workout, I know I can get my workout in 20 minutes. But if I've got 40 minutes or 45 minutes to do a workout, I'll probably still do the same workout, but I'll take more rest, I'll pause for a drink in between, see if my wife's text or called, or look at emails briefly for a minute or two. It's not that commercial environment where I'm taking a selfie and updating Instagram, but it's using a couple of minutes rest between exercises, efficiently for me.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hey guys, I am Lawrence Neal and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that teaches you how to optimize your health, exercise, business, and lifestyle. My former guests include paleo pioneers Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf, zero carb carnivore Dr. Sean Baker, high intensity training experts like Dr. Doug McGuff and Drew Bay, successful entrepreneurs, time management experts, creatives, extreme endurance adventure racers, New York Times best-selling authors, and everything in between. My guests today are Dr. James Steele and Dr. James Fisher, whose names are probably familiar to you as both have featured on my podcast numerous times. Dr. Steele is an associate professor in sport and exercise science, and Dr. Fisher is a course leader and senior lecturer in sports conditioning and fitness. Both are based in Southampton Solent University in the UK. I'm a huge fan of both of these guys. I have learned so much from both of these guys over the last few years, and I really do think they are some of the top experts on the planet with regard to exercise. This was an experimental in-person podcast. So after a grueling workout that they both put me through where I was almost sick, and a meat feast at the local Brazilian restaurant, both guys agreed to record an in-person discussion. I'm going to keep that in because that's just hilarious. To chat about all things strength training. We talk about the role of effort in resistance training, how to motivate loved ones to do exercise, in particular resistance training, what they've both changed their mind about in recent memory since publishing a number of studies on evidence-based resistance training. We talk about training frequency, the importance of supervision, and much, much more. For all of the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org and don't forget to hang around I just can't even talk today. Don't forget to hang around at the end of this episode for your free gift from me. See, if I say it like that, then I don't actually screw it up. And now I give you Dr. James Steele and Dr. James Fisher. Thank you, guys. I'm here with Lawrence here from Corporate Warrior. I'm here with James Fisher and James Steele. We're at Southampton Solent University. We're going to be talking about all things regarding resistance training. I've got a bunch of questions for these guys around the different studies they've done recently and in the past. And I wanted to start off with you, Mr. Steele, or Dr. Steele, I should say. We sadly had to postpone a podcast which is going to be focused on effort in resistance training. And I figured, we'll perhaps do a longer podcast in the future, but I figured we could talk about that a little bit now as well. So you've done a few studies on the role of effort in resistance training, and I read through of those, and I'm just interested to know, why is this role of effort in resistance training important? Why did you decide to look at that?
It's a good question, I think, and so I think what kind of led us onto thinking more deeply about what, like the role of effort, and in particular sort of defining it, how to measure it, and things like that, came from the fact that, when we first worked on those review papers in 2011, 2013, evidence-based resistance training guidelines, one of the things that we looked at as a variable was whether or not training was performed to failure or not. And at the time, we were talking about it as kind of intensity, and the kind of language we used around that has kind of evolved, I think, and we've clarified that what we mean is effort. And I personally feel that we should kind of drop the use of the term intensity because it can cause confusion. Although I appreciate it colloquially, people think of it mostly as being effort. But I think it really started out that. So when we were kind of interested in looking at, okay, if we're training to failure, what we mean by that is training to a maximal intensity of effort. Started to get interested in what impact do different variables potentially have on effort. And one of the traditional way we measure effort, or exertion as it's often referred to, is to use an RPE scale, like the Borg scale, which is a 6 to 20 scale, which is traditionally used for kind of endurance-based activities. More modern iterations of it, like a 0 to 10 scale. There have been specific scales, like the Omni scale, that have been adapted to use for resistance training. Anyway, they're always, in theory, anchored with 10 as being like a maximum effort. And one of the weird things we found was when we started looking at studies looking at different kind of variables like load, set volume, rest periods, and things like that, and the RPEs that people gave when training to failure, it's hardly anyone was giving a maximal rating, which suggested that people were training to failure but not perceiving it as being max effort. And that's where, like, kind of recently our thinking has sort of evolved into, well, what is the perception of effort? How do we define that? Why aren't people giving maximal ratings when in theory they should be giving a maximal rating based on the fact that they're trained to the point where they can't continue exercise anymore, despite in theory trying as hard as they can to meet those demands? And that's where we've moved now more into looking at, well, most previous scales kind of get people confuse the other sensations and perceptions that they have during exercise, such as the discomfort associated with performing certain movements, and they anchor their effort perceptions on that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, low load exercise to failure, people generally, if you don't ask them to differentiate effort and how much discomfort they feel, will give a higher rating of effort for that. But if you get them to differentiate this concept, they're two very, very different things. And I guess to kind of, I suppose, in a roundabout way answer the question, what we've really become interested in is, well, if effort is an important variable, first of all, we have to define it and then be able to measure it properly, independent of other variables that might be influencing that, like discomfort, so we can get a good understanding of what role effort really has in it. Because at the moment, we suspect that training to failure, so a max effort, optimizes outcomes. But there's the possibility that actually there is a sub-maximal effort that optimizes outcomes, and going to failure isn't necessary. But until we define and measure it properly, we don't really know where that is. So it's almost like I'm interested in figuring out what the dose-response relationship between effort and adaptations actually are. And also I'm interested in the role of effort in other kind of behavioural things as well, so like how hard people are willing to train, whether they're adhere to exercise and things like that more broadly as well.
I want to go on to that, and I'm just, because I remember when I talked to Dr. Stuart Phillips, he said, I think we were talking about, the importance of training to failure versus not, and he said that, and I could be getting this wrong because I listened to it a while ago, but he said that even if you're training at like an 8 out of 10, and I know that, that might be not that meaningful based on what you just said, in terms of your own effort, then that might be enough to stimulate a improvement as good as what muscular failure would stimulate. Is that what you hypothesised?
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as giving a specific number. And actually, like when I was in Brazil in November, I chatted with Stu a bit about this, because he was previously, before we spoke about it, was a bit sceptical of how he almost felt was being, arguing semantics when arguing these issues with kind of defining effort properly and measuring it properly and things like that. And I think just using a simple like RPE scale 0 to 10 and saying work to an 8, there'll be a lot of people who might not be. Of course, we don't know where that sub-maximal kind of effort threshold potentially is, if indeed it does exist. I mean, it might just be all gains up until failure, and I mean, we've shown that going past failure doesn't necessarily produce any additional gains, but it might be that you need to get to failure to optimize gains. I think we just don't really know the answer at the moment. But if you're not differentiating effort from other sensations, and some people, for example, if they went to an 8 out of 10, that might not meet whatever that sub-maximal threshold might be. So from a practical perspective, I think we're better off trying to push someone to failure, or using techniques to try and increase their effort, such as, perhaps if they can't get to failure, or they struggle to get to failure, then using cumulative sets to induce fatigue, so that each set progressively feels harder and harder, so that they're working closer and closer towards that maximal effort. Mm-hmm. Or advanced techniques and things like that are useful strategies to potentially just make sure you've hopefully hit that sub-maximal threshold, if indeed it does exist.
Are multiple sets, and I'll ask James this because he's been silent, James Fisher, this is, well, you can give your opinion too on this. Are multiple sets just as good, sub-maximal, like, so training with multiple sets, not to failure, but with a high degree of effort, which I guess is a little bit ambiguous. Is that going to be as effective as one set to failure? For instance, if someone can't can't deal with training to absolute muscular failure, that actually multiple sets might be more ideal for that
Yeah,
person?
well, I mean, the short answer is potentially yes. One of my research students years back, we looked at train to failure versus not to failure. We had a unilateral research design. They did one limb where they trained to concentric failure, and they repeated that performing up to 25 repetitions, and then the other limb did 5x5 training, so they did 5 sets of 5 repetitions with a view to each set being sub-maximal. But what we found, because we measured effort in that study, and what we found is that there was a cumulative increase in effort, and that's what Steele was just talking about, that if you do more volume, you're going to progressively potentially progressively increase recruitment and increase discomfort and increase maybe the metabolic stress and so forth. And ultimately, a single set to failure has, certain adaptations, mechanistic adaptations, or mechanistic characteristics towards adaptation. Well, if you do multiple sets not to failure, your final set probably incurs the similar mechanisms or the similar responses that will incur similar adaptations. And therefore, I think that for some people that can't train to failure or that won't train to failure or would rather spend longer in a gym, there's a reasonable argument for doing multiple sets. I don't have a problem with that. So.
Cool. Going back to role of effort for a second, you talked about potential implications had in terms of like compliance and getting people to exercise, which is something I'm really quite passionate about because there's people I care about that I wish would do more exercise and particularly resistance training. So what have you found? How has this informed that piece of the puzzle?
That's a really good question, and at the moment it's something that we don't really fully understand. It's an interesting thing because I've always been aware, for example, of talking in Brazil, I broke the second or the third part of the talk down into sort of the implications of effort on, first off, the choice to engage in exercise or physical activity, and then secondly, its impact on how hard, once people have made that choice to engage in it, how hard they're willing to actually push themselves in it, and then third, on the adaptations. And out of all those three things, it's the first thing, its impact on the choice to engage in exercise is the one we probably know the least amount. And I've always been, fully aware of the fact that if you look at all of the research around people's barriers to exercise, what they report in studies as being barriers to exercise, the one that constantly gets the most coverage and which seems to be most common is time, mainly, but also accessibility, which is why, for example, I've become more interested in the idea of things like resistance training, exercise to a high effort, really any modality, because that includes accessibility, as being a potential route for public health options. Because if that's what people are saying are the barriers, then you don't need to do very much if you do it to a high effort. But over the last, I'd say 12 to 24 months, I've become more aware that actually there's a body of research that also shows that people often rate the fact that exercise requires a high effort, or they perceive it to require a high effort, is a barrier. People don't like having to try hard things. People want an easy life, and it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We try and maximise reward with a minimum more output of effort. So there's a clear basis for why people abstain from those types of activities unless they perceive the cost-benefit analysis to be favourable.
Did you use an example of, I remember in your slides with the two pictures of one where there was, two pictures of hunter-gatherers, and one had just killed this huge mammoth beast thing, whereas the others, I don't know what they were doing, but I think you associated there being an incentive with the high effort work to kill the beast and that they were getting food, or have I misinterpreted that?
Well, no, the idea there is that in general, from an evolutionary perspective, we would have been more physically active because at that point in time, the cost-benefit ratio to any activity would have been better. So even the lower effort activity required for hunting, for gathering, there was a cost-benefit ratio that was favourable to engaging in that activity. You had to gather to gain, calories for survival. But then there's also a similar cost-benefit analysis. It's not necessarily a conscious thing that goes on, but the caloric benefit, the energy that you're getting back, the reward you're getting back from the effort required to take down a large, prey animal, there's a similar kind of cost-benefit analysis going on. And that paper was actually talking about the role of affect, so the kind of emotional response and stuff we have to the outlay of effort, and how almost kind of what value we ascribe to effort required with things. So, for example, if the reward, the idea is that from an evolutionary basis, if the effort required to obtain, if the reward from being obtained from the effort being output, is large and positive, then we'll gain a kind of positive kind of outlook and affective response from the effort required for that. And in fact, there's some stuff now that shows, effort is kind of almost paradoxical, because in some cases, effort can be perceived as valuable in and of itself. And I think that's probably on an individual basis as well, because I think we'll probably all sit here and go, actually, we're more than willing to go in and do a hard workout, and actually we probably relish some, value from just how hard it feels. There's a subjective kind of value attached to like how hard we feel we pushed ourselves, independent of the fact that the reward we're getting from that exercise ultimately is very, very delayed. It takes a long time for adaptation to occur. But I guess one of the points I was going to loop back to as well is this fact that actually I think we don't understand it fully enough yet, because not only do humans try and avoid effort, but they also try and avoid other things which they would typically use to inform how much effort they think they're putting forth, things like discomfort. So I think we need to understand better whether people don't engage in exercise because they are avoiding effort, or whether they're avoiding the other perceptions and sensations that are associated with them engaging in that type of activity.
Okay, cool. So one of the studies it was quite interesting. You showed that it was an elderly population, supervised resistance training program over 6 months. They made gains in all the areas you would expect, like reduced body fat, muscle mass, increased muscle mass, etc. And then you had them return. So then then you had a 6 month period after that, but those that continued training didn't get better. They actually reverted to baseline just as those that didn't train anymore. And you suppose that this was because they didn't apply enough effort. So do you have any idea I'm just curious, do you have any idea what they ended up doing? And because was it just such low effort that they just got no...
The first thing around that is they didn't return to baseline. So there was two groups. There was a group that continued unsupervised, and there was a group that discontinued, and both groups still showed a positive change after 6 months, or 6 months post the end of the study. So the 6 month intervention has still had a positive effect, even further down the line. So they hadn't returned to baseline. They hadn't regressed to baseline levels.
I mean, they had dropped, but they were still above their original baseline prior to any training.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, it's likely. I mean, that was a progressive intensity study where every few weeks they progressed from non-repetition max to repetition max to momentary failure with advanced techniques of doing drop sets. So they were experienced working at a very, very high intensity. And it might be that in this population and it might be in any population, that they need supervision. People need supervision to do that. I think that's a reasonable assumption, that the individual motivation to push yourself to that level. And it might be an argument for the absence of use of advanced techniques, that once you've gone down that route, you then, what's the next stimulus going to be? You either have to continue that level of stimulus, or you have to find something more. But it's quite likely that this group, just without supervision, simply didn't work as hard. And that's probably true of most people that go into a gym. Most people that I speak to who say they train to failure, when I see them train, don't train to failure. It's not much more black and white than that. So, the evidence, I would go back to the evidence around supervision and say supervision's a key factor around resistance training and intensity of effort, and therefore adaptation.
I mean, in that study as well, I think we were able to look over what their training records were, and they, after the 6 months, I mean, we'd almost hoped that if we did this progressive introduction to, progressively higher intensities of effort, that would ease them into it.
Which it did increase compliance, right, over the initial 6 months.
I mean, over the 6 months, the compliance was really good. Good. I mean, it was what we would expect from a supervised training intervention anyway. But it was post that 6 months that we kind of almost expected that they were carrying training at a high intensity of effort, rather than say taking a group of people and just throwing a group of 80-year-olds, because it was older adults in that population, into like training to failure, drop sets, real tough training. That's probably going to scare them off. So it was almost the hope that this progressive introduction would mean that they would continue it for more, because they'd become more habituated to it. But it highlight, like James said, the importance potentially of that supervised element, because after the supervised component, the ones who continued unsupervised, most of them increased using multiple sets and dropped their loads down, yet for very similar repetition numbers, suggesting that if the loads they were training with previously were allowing them to reach failure, say, at 10 reps, but they were performing 10 reps with a substantially lower load, then they were probably way away from failure in terms of that. So we suspect that they dropped the effort because they didn't have that accountability from someone supervising them. I think this is a big conundrum, though, because from a wider kind of public health perspective, it's not feasible to have everyone supervised training. So it's a really important component, but I think the puzzle is then trying to figure out, well, how do we actually get that to work on a larger scale.
And now it's time for a quick break. Join me this year on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 at the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. We are going to be joined by some amazing speakers, including former head strength and conditioning coach for the University of Michigan, Mike Gittleson. A pioneer in the field, Mike spent 30 years as the head strength and conditioning coach for the University of Michigan's football program. Gittleson was recognized by the Professional Football Strength and Conditioning Coaches Society as the 2003 National Collegiate Football Strength and Conditioning Coach of the Year. An adjunct lecturer in sports management and communication for the Division of Kinesiology, Gittleson was honored with the distinction of becoming an honorary M-Man in 1997. At the event, you will learn from the top strength training researchers, connect with exercise professionals from all over the world, get a workout from an expert trainer, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business. You'll get the chance to chat with guys like Dr. James Fisher, Luke Carlson, and Jim Flanagan. I will be in attendance with many of the Corporate Warrior listeners, and I'd love to meet you in person. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com and enter the coupon code CorporateWarrior10 in PayPal. So again, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off by using Corporate Warrior 10 in PayPal, and I look forward to meeting you in person. And now back to the show. Well, I mean, I guess there's more research needs to be done, but work needs to be done to figure out, how can we get the less motivated, and certainly the older population to engage in resistance training. As I said, that's kind of a preface to this. I kind of said how there's lots of people that I care about who I wish would, we just had a workout today which was incredibly intense, and I was even blown away, to be honest, by the type of intensity that you guys bring to the table, and it really made it clear to me how much, in terms of outliers, we really are, when it comes to training. But if you had to look at everything you have learned about when it comes to compliance and adherence in, I suppose, older untrained populations, have you got any tips for those of us who do want to try and motivate friends, family members to, do this kind of thing more?
Well,
do something.
The first thing is they've got to find the reason to do it. So if they haven't got the right reason to do it, if they haven't got the right why they want to do it, then it isn't going to make any difference. Because you can tell somebody to go in the gym and tell them it's good for them, and if they believe you that it's good for them, they might go in the gym. But unless they want to feel better, unless they've got a sense of their own kind of, for want of a better term, a sense of their own mortality, then they're not going to do it. And then the next thing is, there's no bullshit detector over how hard people work. There was a great study years back that had army recruits run across a plank all morning, and the plank was about 6 inches wide. And after the morning, they asked them how they felt, and they were so confident walking across it, it was unbelievable. And after lunch, they jacked the plank 20 feet into the air, and they had them do the same thing. And they asked them how they felt. Well, they're army recruits, so they all said they were fine. But the bullshit detector was their heart rate. Their heart rate was sky high. When you're walking across a plank that's 6 inches wide and it's 20 feet in the air, your heart rate is sky high. You may have done it all morning 3 inches off the ground. Well, you take somebody into a gym and tell them to train to failure, or get them to train to failure, or coach them to train to failure. Ultimately, you don't know if they do or if they don't. I'm interested in how good trainers are at interpreting the effort level. So that's our first big problem. There's no detection of that at all. So ultimately, what you don't need to do is teach people how to train. What you need to do is teach people the importance of looking after their body. Once you've got past that, the training bit's the easy bit.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but even when you train someone, because we've all had these conversations with people, we've given them compelling arguments backed up by scientific evidence. I talk to you guys, I just pass that message on to people I talk to, and you give them all the knowledge, and I'm pretty good at communicating ideas in a simple way to people, and I can see they understand it. And, I use pretty compelling facts about like the importance of muscle mass and what happens as we age and all of that. But I still think that there obviously has to be a real element of self-advocacy, like of wanting to do it. And so what is that? Why do we have that? I mean, I don't know if that's outside your guys' remit. I know you've looked at some of the psychology around this, so I just wondered if you had a view on that.
I mean, from a general perspective, and we know this from a lot of public health research, knowledge doesn't change behaviour. Like on a large scale. For some individuals it does. Like you said, we're outliers. I'm sure we're individuals who will get knowledge and we act on it. Mm-hmm. We're the outliers though on the tail end of the distribution. Big public health campaigns based around trying to increase awareness and knowledge typically don't work very, very well. It's a tough. I guess the thing is, I don't really know the answer. I'm interested to try and figure out what it is and figure out ways around doing it. I think it's potentially a combination of knowledge, and not necessarily knowledge about the why, but also, because a lot of people I would argue know why they should do it. But again, it comes back to that's if someone has like a near-death experience with some sort of chronic disease or something like that, suddenly realise, oh my god, I need to get back in shape. That might be a big motivator for why for them. But they probably knew that they should probably be doing exercise, doing something beforehand, to keep them healthy. There's very few people I think nowadays who are unaware of the health benefits of some form of exercise and physical activity. But I think part of it might also be knowledge of how, because actually most people, in fact there was I can't remember where I saw it reported, but there was a survey reported recently arguing that the vast majority of people in gyms do not claim they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to use the things. So they default to going in, they know how the treadmill works, and now how to sit on a bike and turn their legs around, and they'll ignore everything else because that's what they know how to do. Mm-hmm. So there's education around how, but again, I think that's secondary to education about how to overcome the barriers to do it in the first place. And I think there always seems to be this kind of like multiple pronged approach to try and get more people to do it. Now, how useful that is on working on an individual basis, I don't know. You have to work out for that individual. What is the thing that's stopping them from doing it? Is it knowledge? Is it how to do it? Is it how to overcome the barriers that are in place stopping them from doing it? Is it just they don't want to do it, but they're not willing to admit that they don't want to do it?
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. It's what we want. People do what they want to do. I'm still blown away when I walk around and see people smoking. Like, why are you smoking? Everybody knows. Like, the knowledge is out there. Everybody knows that smoking kills. It's pretty black and white. There's not much more to it than that. But they smoke because they want to smoke. Well, you can't argue with that logic. They drink because they want to drink, they eat meat because they want to eat meat, or they get vegetarian because they want to be vegetarian, they worship a certain god because of a belief system, and they want to do that. They feel better doing that. So until exercise is pitched in a format, or until people can want to exercise and want to exercise at high enough effort, or want the adaptation that exercise incurs, which still isn't enough. Because if you said, do you want to be leaner, do you want to be healthy, do you want bigger muscles, do you want less injuries and less risk of diabetes, they'd say yes. Well, this is what you've got to do. Oh no, I don't want to do that. Well, until they want to do that, they're not going to do it. And it's to be honest, in my opinion, it's probably that black and white. If you go through the stages, if you go through the psychology and you look at stages of exercise, there's like pre-contemplation. And that's one of the kind of the key stages that people get before they begin exercise. Pre-contemplation. They're pre-thinking about exercise. So they're not even at a point where they're really thinking that they might go to a gym. They're at pre-contemplation stage. Then they're at contemplation. Then they're at maybe beginning adherence and then a continuation. Until they want to do it, it doesn't make any difference.
I was going to say. I think one thing we always need, I've become more aware of now, and I feel I criticised myself a bit in the past is a big thing. I completely agree with that, and I think for many individuals, ourselves included, it is as black and white as that. I think there's something to be said about the fact that most people don't consciously think of these types of things, and there's almost a normalisation and cultural component to it as well. So take, for example, people living in the Netherlands. Like, it's normal to ride a bike. Everyone is very physically active in there. Now, okay, there's general data to suggest that actually they're not that much healthier than most other countries. But, what if we were somehow able to normalise the idea that everyone once or twice a week engaged in some high effort physical activity? Like, if that became a normal cultural thing, then maybe it would be something that people do without thinking about. It becomes as simple as brushing your teeth. You probably don't think about brushing your teeth, you just do it each morning. You don't think about washing your hands after you've been to the toilet because it's just become a very normalised component. And I almost wonder whether actually we're going to learn the most about targeting younger populations and trying to create a cultural norm around these types of activities in those populations so that they grow up and it's already a normal thing for them. They just do it.
I think it's a great point. And from a generational perspective, our parents, our older adults in society right now are really from an era when exercise was a leisure activity. Deliberate choice of going to a gym was a leisure activity. My granddad used to cycle sort of 9 miles to and from work every day. He would never have said that was exercise. He would have said that was him going to and from work. Mm-hmm. So there's still a perception to some extent that, well, this is a leisure activity, and leisure activity is something you do by choice. Mm. Well, we're now saying actually leisure activities or exercise isn't a leisure activity. It should be almost kind of prescriptive, and everybody should have to do it because it'll make you healthier and it'll stop being a burden on the NHS and everything else, and that's great. But there's not that mindset. So I think you're absolutely right to look at younger population and look at a generational shift. And that's what we might see in the longer term. I
also think, and this is kind of come out of left field a little bit, but I was having a conversation with my father yesterday about the elderly and how one of the problems we've got at the moment is they may have to go into care, and in some cases at a relatively young age, because of a number of different conditions. And we know that resistance training can reduce your risk of lots of different diseases, and obviously reduces the risk of someone being in that position, and then if they are in that position and they don't have much money, then their family having to kind of fork that money together to look after that person. I kind of said to my dad, I said, how we can prevent that? Strength training. And I know it's more complicated than that, and there are some things that we don't have as much control over, and that maybe even strength training won't address. And maybe it's more of a holistic thing with diet and so on. But I said to him, if you are able to do that, then you're going to reduce the chance of that happening and you having to go into one of these homes. And because he worries, he's concerned about his children, me and my sister, and the burden that we'll have. And you can see, actually, it's the first time in a while I kind of saw him contemplate strength training more seriously because he cared about the burden. It just seemed to me like an interesting way of going about this in terms of motivating the ones that we love to do training.
For some people, their own, health and wellness is not as valuable to them as the health and wellness of the people they love and the burden that might place on them. So and that's not a type of motivator that can be easily leveraged. You don't want to try and do that. Guilt your parents into taking part in resistance training. Imagine all the burden I'll have of having to take care of you when you get old. Come on. But for some individuals that might be the thing.
Just a thought I wanted to bring up. Okay, cool. So I was also reviewing, James Fisher. I realise if I just say James, it doesn't really mean anything. You're both called James. We were talking recently online about strength training and about some of the latest research, and you reminded me of the papers that both of you put together, which was the Evidence-Based Resistance Training 2013, which focused on recommendations, but focused more on stimulating hypertrophy. And you read that paper, and in turn you switch to the back, and you've got the table of all the recommendations, and the overarching theme is kind of most of this stuff doesn't matter, whether you're doing one set, multiple sets, whether you're doing once, twice, 3 times a week, whether you're doing body weight, machines. What matters is muscular failure and muscle tension. Is that right? And I'd be also interested to know, have you changed your mind on any of that at all since 2013? Have you any new findings, anything like that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that feels like it's such an old paper now. I think the key thing with that paper, and it was preceded by the 2011 recommendations around strength, and what we were really looking at was, it was kind of a follow-on from the ACSM recommendations, and Carpinelli published a really good criticism of the 2009 ACSM recommendations, and we felt like there was scope for some more evidence-based recommendations, and hence the title. Mm-hmm. So the strength paper we published, and like you said, it's pretty simple recommendations. In 2013, which is the one you're referring to, again, it's pretty simple recommendations. Frequency of training doesn't seem to be too high a factor. It might be reasonably individual, but probably once or twice a week is sufficient. Certainly, there's no need for most of the population to be more frequent than that. Training to momentary failure seems to be one of the key factors. Volume doesn't seem to make a huge difference. Certainly exercise type doesn't make any difference. Your muscles don't know whether you're doing a wall sit or a leg press. And I say wall sit because James Steele's in the room. So as long as your muscles...
I've been doing one this whole time.
As long as your muscles...
World record, 31-minute wall sit.
As long as your muscles under tension, you're doing what you need to do. And, the research coming out of Stu Phillips' lab is supporting that low lows when taken to that effort level will stimulate hypertrophic adaptation. It's interesting actually that you ask what's changed on that. In my mind, not much. I think most of the evidence that's come out since then has supported that. I think a lot of the stuff looking at single joint, multi-joint by Paolo Gentile and ourselves is still supporting that. And you could probably look at a more abbreviated workout by doing multi-joint exercises.
Have you met much in the way of criticism on single joint versus multi-joint? Even though saw that paper from Paolo, I've seen some trainers kind of critique that in their own way. And I just wondered, have you addressed any criticisms of that?
Not evidence-based criticisms. No, I think that people. We went in the gym today and we all did bicep curls. So we were all looking at our single joint. We did knee extension then bicep curls. So we've done a ton of single joint exercise. But actually, some people want to do single joint exercises, and that's fine. I think that if you said to people you can do one exercise, what is it? Most people would probably pick a multi-joint. If you said right now you can have a second, they'd probably still pick another multi-joint. Mm-hmm. If you said a third, again probably another multi-joint, and you've now probably got a lower body and upper body push and upper body pull, and it's probably only the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th exercises that start adding single joint. So I think inherently people know multi-joint are more productive than single joint exercises. Mm-hmm. And they know that they'll probably get good stimulation in their biceps from doing pull-ups or pull-downs, and in their knee extensors from doing leg press and so forth. But ultimately, if people want to do more volume, adding single joint movements is fine. Mm-hmm. If people want to focus on specific muscle groups, adding single joint movements is fine.
But you don't think there's any upside to adding them, is the point? Like in terms of hypertrophy?
The thing I would say on that is, so the latest evidence we have published, and I think there are, at this current point in time, a couple of legitimate criticisms. And one is, actually, currently there's no published literature on comparing multi-joint to single-joint lower body movements. The caveat to that being, ourselves and Paolo and some other authors have got a couple of studies looking at that exact topic of review at the moment, so there'll be some data coming out on that. But actually, there is at least one area
Can you elaborate, or is it secret?
Yeah, there's very little difference. Sorry, Paolo, if I spoiled it. But there is at least one area where we do know that it seems as though a single joint movement is potentially important, and that is with lumbar extensors. It seems to be something that's very hard to target with compound multi-joint trunk extension movements. And we talked about that in our paper. I mean, it gets overlooked because the people interested in that are the people interested in specifically working that musculature for a particular reason. I mean, there's very few fitness pros out there and general public interested in having massive lumbar extensors, so it often gets overlooked. But we've fully acknowledged where there is and where there isn't evidence for single or multi-joint exercises being of more or less value. So I think we've taken a pretty kind of open-minded and evidence-based approach to it. But generally speaking, I suppose you could broadly say, probably get the most you can get out of what we're doing.
To go back to your key question about is there anything that I think that I've changed my mind on since that paper, I think volume and hypertrophy is an interesting area. I listened to James Krieger's podcast with yourself, and I think he raised a fair point, and I'm always interested to listen to his and Brad's podcasts because I kind of take two approaches to it. The first of which is they're academics, and I think you should give them the respect to listen to what they say. And the other approach is probably best described as know your enemy. They tend to present opposing views to myself, so I want to hear what their argument is around it and see if what they say changes my opinion, or if I feel like I would rebut that if I was in a conversation with them. And I think James Krieger raised a really good point that he said, if there was no effect by volume, then there would be more. Then all the studies would be centered around a no effect. There would be some that showed single sets were beneficial. There would be some that showed multiple sets were beneficial, or higher volume were beneficial. But generally, there's a trend towards, and I say the trend very loosely. There are some studies that show higher volumes are better, and some studies showing volume doesn't make a difference. I think that a big area in all of this is volume frequency and volume load. So I know by my experience that now and then I feel the need to do more abbreviated workouts with 3 or 4 exercises, but maybe train every other day. Or I feel the need to do maybe 8 or 10 exercises or 12 exercises and train every 4th day or every 5th day. And I think that the study, the meta-analysis, another meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and co., was looking at number of sets per muscle group, and they suggested 10 sets per muscle group. Well, we had an interesting discussion just among the authors, myself, James Steele, Paolo Gentile, Jürgen Giesing over in Germany, and my response to that was, that's absolutely fine. I'm okay with that. 10 sets per muscle group. Yeah, I think most people who do high intensity training probably do 10 sets per muscle group. If you do, 3 exercises that stimulate the shoulders and you train 3 times per week, well, that's 9 sets. So you're pretty much there on your 10 sets per muscle group. If you do, a couple of compound body and isolation exercise for your back, well, there you go. If you do seated row pull down and maybe a pullover, well, that's your 3 exercises for your lats. Bear in mind, the lats probably get some pretty good stimulation from other exercises as well, just by the nature of the effort you're applying. So I think that actually this volume issue is that there's multiple approaches to it, and I'm not saying that I've changed my opinion and I now agree with higher volumes, but I'm saying that there's multiple approaches to volume of training, and I'm not as dogmatic as the old school high intensity of training of once per week, big 5 workout where you only stimulate one muscle group once per week and then rest it 7 days. I think that you could arguably stimulate it more and maybe incur greater adaptations. You might not need to, but for people who are in a low stress environment, who are getting sufficient sleep, who are looking at their nutrition appropriately and are optimizing all the other variables, they might incur greater adaptation by doing a higher volume, whether that's through more exercises, through more sets, or through a higher frequency.
Yeah, I really, and personally, I struggle with high volume at where I am. I find that, I don't know whether that's because I built up a certain amount of strength for me that I can deliver so much damage to myself through those first couple of exercises. Both know I do a bodyweight routine, and I might start off with push-ups and go into pull-ups, and then I can only really do, I don't know, part of it might be psychological, I'm not sure, or the fact that I'm unsupervised, or fill in the blank, but I can only really do 1 or 2 other exercises after that, and I'm just fried. And I know it would seem that others can do more volume. Maybe that's just a genetic thing, Have you got any view on that at all?
I think the other thing around volume, is people take rest intervals. I think I spoke with you probably a year or so back now with Luke Carlson as well. We did a three-way Skype, and one of the things that we both said is that our workouts are done at our own pace. I seldom feel the need, if I've got 20 minutes to do a workout, I know I can get my workout in 20 minutes, but if I've got 40 minutes or 45 minutes to do a workout, I'll probably still do the same workout, but I'll take more rest, I'll pause for a drink in between, I'll maybe see if my wife's text or called, or look at emails briefly for a minute or two. And it's not that commercial environment where I'm taking a selfie and updating Instagram, but it's using a minute a couple of minutes rest between exercises, efficiently for me. And I'll do that. And I don't think that's inappropriate. I think I'm okay with that, irrespective of what other people think. But I know that recovery allows me to approach the next exercise with, a little bit of following a little bit of a rest, a little bit fresher, a little bit more prepared to do it. And if I'm doing an 8 or 10 exercise workout, then I'm quite content to do that.
I mean, going on to that as well, I think there's almost there's a tendency in the high intensity training community and the trainers around that, and a lot of the kind of well-known names who make recommendations around that type of training, that you need to have this kind of quote-unquote rush factor, and you need to rush between exercises because that keeps your heart rate high and it maximises the aerobic and kind of respiratory adaptations that you're going to get from it in addition as well. And there's been a lot pinned on the idea that the benefits that you're getting on top of strength, hypertrophy, power, etc., that you're getting to kind of respiratory system are down to the fact that you minimise rest in between exercises. But actually, back in 2012 when we wrote our review paper on the effects of resistance training to failure on cardiorespiratory fitness and the physiological adaptations associated with that. Appreciably, there's a limited amount of research on it, but there's no research to suggest that you need to do that in order to maximise those adaptations. Whether the studies that we looked at, whether they minimise rest periods between and did it in that kind of almost circuit fashion.
Yeah.
Because that was how the original Nautilus circuit was kind of pitched, and that's, I suppose, where that concept was popularised from, the idea of rushing between exercises to get that cardiorespiratory benefit. In the studies where they had defined rest periods between them, minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, they still showed those adaptations. So it almost seemed as though it was like a non-factor in terms of improving those aspects. So I think you're almost better, like James said, like when we both do it, we'll do an exercise and we'll wait till we feel ready to do the next exercise. And it might be 30 seconds, it might be a minute, it might be 2 minutes, it might be 3 minutes, and when you feel ready to go in and do it, then do it. I think like Brad and those guys have done some stuff on rest intervals recently as well. And they've, there's always been the idea that minimising rest intervals optimises hypertrophy as well because it maximises metabolic stress and things like that. And the studies they've done, meta-analyses as well, have suggested that actually counterintuitively to that idea, that longer rest intervals maximise hypertrophy. And they've interpreted that as suggesting, well, if you rest longer, then in your subsequent sets or subsequent exercises, you can do more volume because you've recovered more. I wonder whether that's really the explanation for it, and I wonder whether really, like you said, if you have too little rest in between exercises, you might even go into the next exercise or the next set and not really give the effort that you that you gave on the first one. So that could be an explanation. It could be the volume thing. Who knows? But I think any way you cut it, you don't need to rush between exercises.
I think the only issue I have is I'm the whole point of this podcast and the vlog is I'm obsessed with efficiency, right? I want to just get it done and get out, but not at the expense of getting lesser results. I want to get the best results I can get. So if I am to abbreviate my workouts for that purpose, am I likely to get less results than if actually or less gains versus increasing the rest, maybe doing a bit more volume?
I would say look at it this way. I'm thinking from a practical perspective here. So you train in a public gym, right?
No. Well, sometimes at gym, sometimes at home.
Sometimes at home. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think sometimes Okay. If you look at it from the perspective of a multiple set, full body workout that could take you an hour versus doing that same workout with single sets and it might take you 20 minutes. The difference between, say, doing 10 exercises single set and 5 exercises single set, the difference between 10 and 20 minutes is very little.
True.
It's not as big as the difference between 20 minutes and an hour or something like that. And I do appreciate the idea of like efficiency, but I think we can take that to the nth degree, to the point where it's like really is that extra 10 minutes worth it? Like, are you sure there's not times in your day where you waste 10 minutes doing something inane and stupid anyway? Where maybe if you're worried about potentially the effect of doing that reduced number of exercises or volume, then maybe it's more efficient to utilise those extra 10 minutes to do a few extra exercises, but wait a little bit extra in between. I do think the efficiency component from high intensity of effort resistance training has always been an argument that people put that hat on. But for me, it's always felt like a very weak component of it. Really, I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I like the efficiency of high intensity training. I think that's what I do put my arm around it. I think to me it's evidence-based training. It's the dose response. It's the minimal dose to get to stimulate the responses that you want, the adaptations that you want. But if you could get more with a rest, then you could get more. Now, whether you'd incur greater adaptations or not, really, you're own N=1 study, so try it. Yeah. I think that, in an effort to maximise efficiency, we sort of say, there's the more haste, less speed approach. Are you rushing through it for the sake of rushing through it, or are you rushing through it to get the most from the workout? And if I would hate to think that I start an exercise without feeling like I can reach that point, because if I can't reach that point, there's no point doing the exercise. I'd rather just not do the exercise and call it a day there. Leave the gym or go back to my office or go home or whatever it might be. If you're doing such abbreviated workouts, 2-3 exercises, I don't think there's any problem with that. But I would then say, how frequently are you training? Because I know that from your approach, Lawrence, you've taken you add more rest, you stop making adaptations, you add more rest. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that, from that perspective, I think you can probably, if I was doing a 3 exercise workout, I'd probably train 3 days a week. Mm-hmm. I'd probably train at least every third day, sometimes every other day. Mm-hmm. And I'd feel happy doing that because I'm doing enough to, one, stimulate my metabolism to allow me to eat what I want to eat, and as you can see, I've got a pretty good appetite. But also...
That's because we had lunch earlier, not because he's fat.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just in case any listeners misinterpreted that.
Yeah, I couldn't say that myself, but I did prompt James Steele to say that. So I think that, you play with your own workouts. Gary Knight said the other day, once people plateau and they're genuinely being honest with their workouts and with their nutrition, vary something, change something, add more rest, maybe increase the increased frequency, decrease volume, increase volume, change something. Brad would love that idea, vary it. And I think that's a good approach.
Yeah. We talked about this recently, frequency, on the podcast, and I'm just curious, because I was going to come on to this anyway, is your recommendation basically at the end of that podcast was full body workouts 2 to 4 times a week, no downside, and will probably get you the best results you can get. Do you still kind of believe that is probably the optimal?
I mean, in that conversation, I think one of the things I highlighted was there's a theoretical basis for where high frequency might work, and I talked about the kind of the weighing up of the volume within each workout, the potential impact on recovery, and so on and so forth. I'm actually going to come back to the question you asked earlier about, is there anything you changed your mind about?
Okay, yeah.
And I think one of the things I've changed my mind about is James said earlier, like Gary said, if you're honest with yourself and you feel that you've plateaued, you've been honest with your workouts, Barry said something. I would say the thing I've become more convinced of is once you've plateaued. Like Richard Feynman used to say, no, science is all about, not fooling yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. And I think we are very good at, we're all hopeful, we all want to be able to continue long-term adaptation and continue to improve and grow muscle and get stronger, blah, 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 blah. But I'm becoming more and more, like we said earlier, a nihilist in terms of this. I just don't think we have the capacity to continue adapting, and I think add variety, great, don't get bored with your training, keep it going. If you stop completely, you detrain. You've got to keep going to continue maintaining it. But I'm becoming less and less. I'm less and less convinced that we have the ability on an individual basis, let alone even studies, to differentiate small changes that we think might be occurring over long periods of training.
Awesome. I think that's a good place to wrap it up, because I know you guys got stuff to do. What's that, 50 minutes? So thanks everyone for listening, and I will talk to you all soon.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com, that's CORP warrior.com, to get your free high-intensity training Google Progress chart, an ebook with 6 interview transcripts of some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are deliberately not verbatim. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, enter your email address, then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you will be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This episode is brought to you by the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. Would you like to learn from the top strength training researchers, network and connect with other exercise professionals from all over the world, join a welcome reception on a Friday night to build relationships with other strength training professionals, experience an early morning workout from an expert trainer to kickstart your Saturday, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business? I certainly do, and that is why I am attending and interviewing all of the speakers at the event. The Resistance Exercise Conference will be held on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Commons Hotel. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, click the registration button, and enter Corporate Warrior 10 in the promo code field in PayPal. I'm very excited about this, and I've wanted to attend for years. Sign up now at resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off with promo code Corporate Warrior 10, and I look forward to meeting you in person.